Hello, all. We are going to go ahead and get started. I'm sure that more folks are going to trickle in, but it's lovely to see you. We have this and then one more session of this festival. So thank you so much for joining us. My name is Hannah Henza. I'm the Director of Networks and Leadership with Mood North America, and I am very happy to have Janna Siller here from Adamah and the Adamah farm talking about regenerative agriculture. So Janna, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Hannah. I'm going to go ahead and start by sharing my screen. Okay. Hi, everyone. Good to see you all. Welcome. As people trickle in, we'll welcome them. And you're invited to share anything you'd like in the chat or ask questions as we go. And we'll have especially time for questions at the end. And if you wouldn't mind starting off by sharing in the chat your name and where you're zooming in from. And if you want to share, if you can think, this will be easier or harder for different people. Think of the last thing or something that you saw growing that either you ate or at least was edible. So maybe you have a garden and you can share about your garden plants that were growing. Maybe you raise a milk cow and you can share the name of your milk cow. And maybe you're in a city and you saw some ornamental rosemary growing outside of a restaurant. Or maybe it was back in your childhood, the last time that you saw something growing that you were able to eat, or at least that was edible. So if you would share that in the chat, just so we get a chance to meet each other a little bit. I'll share for myself. My name is Janna Siller, and I am zooming in from what we often call the Interdependent Republic of Housatonica. That's our way of saying Falls Village, Connecticut, which is on the Housatonic River watershed. So we so often, when we introduce ourselves and think about where we're from, we think about the political boundary, the city, the state, the country that we're in. But what about the watershed or the ecological boundary of where we're from? So I'll share Interdependent Republic of Housatonica, the Housatonic River watershed, which is Falls Village, Connecticut. I'm at the Isabella Freedman Jewish Retreat Center, which is an Adamah campus. Adamah being the Jewish environmental organization that hopefully you've had a chance to connect with, and if you haven't in the past, hopefully will in the future. Let's see where other folks are zooming in from. Richard Marker is zooming in from Bethesda, Maryland, and I'm originally from Rockville, so not far from where I'm from. And you have parsley on your 9th floor balcony. Amazing. It's amazing what an herb can do and where an herb can grow. Scott Lewis is from Pembroke Pines, Florida, and there is a backyard situation eating butterfly pea flowers and hot peppers. Oh, yum. In Florida, of course, you can already be harvesting at this time of year. Bob is in Ossining, New York, and Bob's wife is growing some parsley. Another parsley just in time for Pesach in our small green room. Amazing. Hannah's in Greensboro, North Carolina, and she was recently on a farm and tasted fava bean leaves. Yum. Fava beans are a really cool crop if you've never had a chance to taste them. They're a really big bean, and yeah, the leaves are edible. Louise Lipsy is in San Rafael, California, and your backyard garden includes vegetables, herbs, etc. Yum. And Ash Sofman is in the greater Philadelphia area, technically New Jersey. And you have peas, radishes, onions, and one random carrot. Sometimes the carrot just decides that's where it's going to grow. Currently starting to grow, and hopefully green beans and more carrots coming up. Yum. And Richard is mirrorless about the whole farm on the balcony. Amazing. Amazing. And Myron is growing okra in the backyard. Okra is a really up and coming crop for a lot of regenerative farmers. And if you don't know what regenerative is referring to in farming, you're about to find out. People are really into okra these days, and they're protected by native ants. Amazing. Yeah. Okay. And if you're just joining us, we're adding to the chat our name, your pronoun, if you'd like to share your pronoun, where you're zooming in from, where in the world you're zooming in from. And the last thing that you were able to eat, food that you were able to watch grow and eat, or at least something that you can remember that you've seen growing that's edible. And Scott's asking why okra is regenerative, just that it's actually a really a crop that can be well adapted to a lot of places that's overlooked. And there's some breeding going on with okra that people are excited about. So David is in Highland Park, Illinois, and as a child, David grew corn, watermelon, carrots, etc., but now lives in an apartment building. Volume. Okay, so let's dive in. I'll share a little bit more about myself. As I shared when we opened, I'm here at the Adamah farm. I'm the farm director here at Isabella Freedman Jewish Retreat Center in Falls Village, Connecticut on the Housatonic River watershed. And our farm is unique. Every particular space for growing is a special little microclimate of its own. And some other things that make our farm unique are that we are a campus of Adamah, Jewish Environmental Organization, here at Isabella Freedman, and we run the Adamah Fellowship Program. So we invite groups of 10 to 15, 20 to 30-year-olds onto the farm for 3 months at a time to participate in our fellowship program. We run a summer cohort and a fall cohort, and you can see some of those fellows here on the screen. To work on the farm, to live in Jewish community, to experience land-based Judaism together, and to learn, to study, and to grow a lot of food. And being a Jewish farm is a very special thing. People often ask, what exactly is it that makes it a Jewish farm? Is it the Shabbat practice? Do you bless the soil in a certain way? And what it is that we're Jewish people who are farming together and being in a space that we want to experience Jewish life through. And that much makes farm. And it means something completely different for each person who joins us. For some people, they're really reconnecting to ancestry and people who have farmed for generations in their lineage. For others, it's really about studying Jewish agricultural texts and understanding texts anew through experience with life on the land. For others, it's really about celebrating Shabbat and being able to work, do physical labor, and then stop and rest for Shabbat. For others, it's really about just singing Jewish songs and prayers in the fields. And for still others, they're just beginning a connection with their Judaism. So there's so many things that makes it a Jewish farm. We also consider ourselves a regenerative farm. So what makes us a regenerative farm? The word regenerative is favored by a lot of us in the movement, but there are so many words that you can use to try to get at this idea that we're growing food, we're producing sustenance for human bodies, for human beings, in ways that not only don't deplete the natural resources around us, not only don't take more than we give to the ecosystem, but also that actually increase the amount of life, increase the biodiversity, increase the carbon in the soil, increase the capacity, the life-holding capacity of the space that we're in. So that's really, when you hear the term regenerative, that's what it means. It's very similar to using the word sustainable, organic. Organic has a very specific legal definition. When you see a label that says organic, it means that there has been a USDA certified inspection of the farm to make sure that there are no chemicals, to make sure that practices are being used that are generally helpful to biodiversity and increasing organic matter in the soil, all of those things. Whereas other words that you see sometimes natural, biological, those don't necessarily have a legal definition, but they get at a similar idea. So the more you can actually have a connection to a farm that's using a particular word, regenerative, organic, sustainable, natural, biological, any of those, the more you can have that relationship and understand what someone means by that, of course, the better. So that's a little bit about our farm. You can see us here on the left-hand corner. Our very tech-savvy teenage neighbor and community member has a drone and was able to capture this particular view of the farm, although we'll see some more views of the farm as we go and try to understand again what it means to be a regenerative Jewish farm, and what it means to be a person eating from, we're all eating from farms, although we don't usually know exactly where they are. So there's some more to the farm, but I'll just point out a couple things. One, you can see we're in a very forested area. So being in a forest ecosystem is really helpful for just having a lot of wildlife in general and having a lot of beneficial insects and wildlife that kind of help us keep balance. On the farm, you can see strips of vegetables here. And then we have a lot of perennials on the farm. You can't see so well, but this is a patch of raspberry brambles. We've got blueberries over here. These are hazelnut bushes. These are currant bushes, mulberry trees. We also we make a lot of compost using food waste from the Isabella Freedman Jewish Retreat Center. So this is our compost yard. That's a chicken coop. Chickens graze on the compost piles and are able to sustain themselves on the pizza crusts and the orange peels that don't get eaten, but rather get brought up as food waste. And then you can actually see in this picture, if you squint, or depending how big your monitor is, this is a pile of fresh food scraps here. Again, those pizza crusts, the banana peels that all come up here, mixed with hay and leaves. And these, you notice, are a dark brown color because they are all the way broken down. So they're that humus. They're the, fully digested and broken down food waste that's great for putting right onto the vegetable beds to grow really healthy vegetables without using synthetic fertilizers. We have a high tunnel here that helps protect our crops and warm them. Some of our crops that we grow in there. And that's a very high level tour of the farm. You got the tour from above. And then we also have more perennials and an agroforestry project that we'll take a look at. So, oops. Okay, so we're here to think about the climate, right? We know we have this problem of having more carbon dioxide specifically and other greenhouse gases in the sky than we need. And we don't always realize and think about that in terms of a cycle. We don't always think about, we hear CO2, carbon dioxide, greenhouse gases. We hear these things. And Earth really operates through cycles. Of course, we're coming from a Jewish tradition that also is very familiar with the idea of a cycle of 7, the days of the week, a cycle of 7 years before a Shemitah rest cycle. So we're familiar with this idea of cycles. And of course, in ecology, that's really important too. So let's take a minute to think about food and farming and climate in relation to the carbon cycle. And I took this picture, I staged this picture years ago in an attempt to kind of get at the different ways that we as humans interact with the carbon cycle. So one way that we interact with the carbon cycle, of course, is that we grow plants. And CO2 is the lowest energy form of carbon, and plants use it out of the atmosphere, out of the air, along with energy from the sun and water from the soil to form higher energy forms of carbon. So that's what's happening. This looks like a peaceful little scene. That's what these buckwheat plants are doing. They're doing this incredible, miraculous, unbelievable process of taking CO2, energy from the sun, water together, putting it into into carbohydrates, forms of carbon that are then useful when we, in our second line here, we eat them. So we, as human beings, are heterotrophs, unlike plants that are autotrophs, which can make their own energy. We need to eat our energy. So we either eat plants that are, that have photosynthesized, or we eat animals who've eaten plants or animal products that made their bodies and their milk or eggs out of plants. And that's a way that we interact with the carbon cycle, because we're using that as the energy to fuel this conversation that we're having, and all the different things that we do in a day. Of course, we also breathe. So we've represented that back here. We've got someone taking a breath. We've got someone eating, although raw buckwheat plants are not so delicious, but for the sake of the tableau, Molly back here is taking a nibble. And we also have another form of interacting with the carbon cycle, which is that we like to dig up fossilized carbon in the form of fossil fuels and burn them. So this is a weed whacker here. And if we think about this, okay, here we have a crop of buckwheat. And if we want to do something with it, we need some energy to harvest it, to dig it, whatever we want to do with it. We need some energy. In this case, Meredith over here with the shovel has eaten something that morning for breakfast, I presume, and is burning that energy in order to dig. Whereas Carly and Alana here are using a different kind of energy to do something with it, right? They're using fossil fuels by putting some gasoline in the weed whacker. So when we burn fossil fuels that are, again, it's just really concentrated carbon, when we burn those, and of course, the emissions create kind of a blank. That's why we took this photo in this little hoop house, greenhouse, because it sort of, forms makes it more difficult for heat energy to bounce back out into outer space when we build it up in the atmosphere. So I present all of this. Most of us have a general big, working understanding of the carbon cycle. And I think it's really helpful to understand in terms of trying to think about different ways of approaching the problem of how do we feed ourselves? How do we feed ourselves? How will we interact with the carbon cycle when we're trying to make management decisions as a farmer, or make decisions about which types of farms we want to get our food from, and which policies we should support in terms of helping farmers who do different types of practices. So down here on our list, after we burn, we also have another way that we interact with the carbon cycle, which is to till and or sequester. So what I mean by that is that here, Meredith is digging the buckwheat plants. If she digs the shovel down, flips the plant over, and buries it in the ground, that's a way of sequestering carbon. All that carbon that the plants took out of the air and used to form their bodies then gets stored in the soil. So this is a really important concept for understanding what we need in light of the climate crisis that we're in the middle of, what we need farmers to do. We need them to be in a process of using photosynthesis, this incredible miracle of photosynthesis, to store carbon in the soil. And we'll look at what that looks like on farms, how farmers are doing that. And then I want to just add, before we go on to exploring that and thinking about what types of foods we eat and how that relates to tillage and to sequestering carbon, I want to think a little about another way that we interact with carbon, which is that we have both a spiritual and an emotional relationship to the carbon cycle, to our existence on Earth, to the fact that we take up a share of the resources on the planet. And one thing that I like to think about these lines from the morning liturgy. In our Jewish tradition, we wake up in the morning and we say these words, Modeh ani lefanecha ruach chai v'kayam. We're saying these words, offering thanks, for waking up, for being here, for being on this planet. And one intention I want to offer, maybe next time you say Modeh ani, or if that's a new practice for you or a new words that you're encountering in this moment, thinking about it in relation to what I just shared about the carbon cycle. So often, I think when we encounter or face the reality of the climate crisis, I know that I have certainly been on my own journey of wondering if I'm using so much, if I'm releasing too much carbon, like, am I a burden on the system? Am I, how do I sort of own that reality that I'm part of this this excessive buildup of greenhouse gases, um, and something I love about returning to the tradition is that we don't have to ask that question. We can just remember we start off in the morning and we're grateful we are here. We know that in and of itself is the right thing. We're grateful for being a part of this greater whole. And then we get to decide what to do with that, right? Then we move on with our day and we get to decide what to do with it. So I'll offer this potential intention for your Modeh ani practice. I'm grateful for my share of carbon. I deserve it, and I won't take it for granted. And then I'll also, use my connection to community, my learning to try to make the best decisions that I can in terms of how to interact with that. So, okay, so trying to understand and sort of lean into Jewish tradition to help us understand what it looks like to be a farmer at this particular moment. The climate crisis, wealth inequality that we know is a huge part of our food system. And here are 3 examples of ways that we at Adamah and Jewish farms really around the world are leaning into Jewish values and Jewish tradition to as for guidance in farming. And the one up here on the right, this is from our Shavuot, which is not too far away. We've got a different holiday to get through first, but our Bikurim parade. This is a celebration of the first fruits, and it's a biblical tradition and has been in some ways a metaphor for many over the years of Jewish history. And on our farm, it's also a very literal practice. And of course, we have to get dressed up, and maybe some of us put on a rooster costume to celebrate and to really, experience that awe for what's coming out of the ground. So I think that element of awe, whether you are, some of us, it sounds like, have rooftop gardens and backyard gardens, and some of us don't have access to that, and that's not a part of our day. But all of us have access to this incredible miracle of sustenance and of food, but food in the deepest sense. And taking those moments and leaning into the Jewish practice of blessing and pausing to really experience that awe for what it is that we have and that we get to be a part of. And so that's our Bikurim basket there. Down here on the right, we'll talk more about this particular regenerative practice, but these are cover crops. Cover crops are types of plant, or it's a category of crop that you're not growing to harvest. You're not growing it because you want to eat it, but you're growing it specifically to rejuvenate the land. So these here, Adam is sitting among clover and peas and oats, and just watching them do something very special, which is to photosynthesize, of course, and produce carbon that we can then integrate back into the soil and store as food for the next crop. And some of these plants in here are legumes, which are a type of plant that creates a symbiotic relationship with bacteria, rhizobia bacteria, that can take nitrogen out of the air and put it into the soil. This is a really important note on regenerative farming, this practice of growing legume cover crops, because the single biggest use of fossil fuels in agriculture is from the production of manufactured fertilizers that get put onto the soil to grow food. Because in order to manufacture these nitrogen fertilizers that are very widely used around the world, we need a lot of heat and a lot of pressure, and that heat and pressure is produced by the use of fossil fuels. And so when farmers or gardeners sprinkle those little white pellets of manufactured fertilizers on the soil, they have come at great fossil fuel use. So legumes can do the same thing just by photosynthesizing to grow their own bodies, and then sharing those sugars that they produce in the form of carbohydrates with rhizobia bacteria that are hanging out on their root nodules. So it's this really incredible process of putting nitrogen into your soil by growing legume cover crops. So we think about that in terms of the Jewish practice of Shemitah, every 7 years, taking a year to rest and release the land. And that really comes from this same need, this very desperate need that farmers throughout history, ever since the beginning of farming, have found to put nutrients back into their soil. If you take it out, you grow a big cabbage, you harvest it, you eat it, you get the nutrition from it, but where did it come from? It came from the soil, and we need to put something back into the soil. So how we do that has been a big question over time, and this practice of resting the land once every 7 years really had this same effect of growing plants, just wild plants that would sprout and grow, that would then, be that carbon, that organic matter going back into the soil. So that's a piece of what inspires us, and a connection between, again, our Jewish tradition and our regenerative farming movement that goes beyond the Jewish community, but something that we as Jewish farmers bring to it. And then here on the left, this is Food Pantry Delivery Day. These are some of our Adamah fellows and staff holding boxes of produce that are on their way to the food pantry. And we have Jewish biblical traditions of making sure to share the abundance harvested with both, of course, with ourselves for sustenance and our community, and also those community members who are struggling financially to be able to otherwise afford the food. So this is a big part of how we understand our obligation as farmers, is to be accessible. Okay, so this chart here is just to remind us of the relevance of the food system in terms of mitigating climate change. So this is a chart put together, and it's a little old, and I'm sure there are many different ways of calculating the biggest contributions to greenhouse gas emissions, but this is one by Project Drawdown that I've really found very useful and well researched. And you can see the number one climate solution on this list is refrigerant management, which actually is very related to the food system, of course, because we use a lot of refrigeration in the food system. But this is really about, and we've come a long way even since this list was put together, in legislation around those really high emission refrigerant chemicals, and shifting toward less polluting refrigeration management. But of course, number 3 here is reducing food waste. So the reason why food waste is such a big issue in terms of mitigating climate change is that the production of food is very fossil fuel intensive. And when we waste half of it, then of course, there was no use in emitting those greenhouse gases in the first place for the food that didn't get eaten. And when so much of our food waste ends up in landfills, and in landfills, when it doesn't have proper opportunity to break down aerobically because it's in an anaerobic environment, there's a lot of methane emission. So, and that of course is a very potent greenhouse gas. So reducing food waste is a big one. Eating a plant-rich diet is the big one. Down here, we have silvopasture as number 9. That's grazing animals in and among trees. And regenerative agriculture is sort of a broad category, which I would say silvopasture really kind of folds into that term, regenerative agriculture. But we've got conservation agriculture here at 16th, tree intercropping. So you can see that on this list of top 20 solutions, a lot of them really lie in food and farming. So why is that? What are some examples of regenerative farming, conservation farming, these types of words that we hear a lot? Here are a few examples. So in this top picture on the top left, this is a cover crop that's growing, the green plants that have already sprouted. And here, the bare soil, this is bare soil. It happens to be, this is on our farm, and it happens to be that we just seeded a cover crop here, so it hasn't come up yet, so don't worry, we're not leaving our soil bare. But bare soil is the opposite of regenerative farming. I just spoke to the miraculous power of photosynthesis, so we want our soils photosynthesizing all the time. We never want to be losing soil when, this soil is very vulnerable to erosion when it rains or is windy. It can just fly away, and all those nutrients for growing the next crop are lost. And whereas when we're photosynthesizing in the soil, we're doing that process of taking carbon out of the air and putting it into the soil. So cover cropping is a really, really big regenerative farming solution, and reducing the amount that we disturb the soil. Every time that you till or disturb the soil, you release a certain amount of carbon. And so the less that you do that, the more you can be photosynthesizing and leaving the soil undisturbed, the better. Over here on the right, you can see this picture of this incredibly beautiful root ball. This is a perennial grain crop. It's the wild ancestor of wheat, actually. So when humans domesticated grains, they were taking wild grasses and finding, the biggest, most beautiful, most nutritious, most delicious seed heads, and then saving the seeds from those particular plants that they found in a wild population and growing those. And over many years, they would get to a point of selecting for populations that really had the characteristics that they were looking for. But they weren't necessarily always selecting for sustainability or the capacity to regenerate soils. And so on the right here, this is just a standard run-of-the-mill wheat crop, and you can see the root system here. I don't know if you can see me outlining with the arrow, but it really, this is as deep as it goes. And the reason why our modern wheat varieties don't need deep root systems is that we plant them every year. So we disturb the soil, we till it, we make it look like this, bare soil. By we, I mean just as a global human population. This is the general method for growing grains that go into our bread, our pizza crust, our pasta, our rice, all of these things, is that we plant them as annual crops. So we disturb the soil, we plant them, they only get a root about this deep. They don't need a much deeper root because we're feeding them lots of fertilizers and things. So they don't need to go too much deeper. And they, produce a beautiful, delicious, in many cases, nutritious crop of grain. Over here, though, our wild ancestor, just look at that. When we think back to our carbon cycle that we talked about, this is really holding the soil in place, producing organic matter in the soil. Roots have this incredible capacity they're learning more and more every day about root exudates. So much of the carbohydrates, sometimes up to a third, almost a half of the carbohydrates that a plant will produce through photosynthesis, it actually sends out to feed the microbial community in the soil, because it gets that much benefit back. The plant gets that much benefit back from the microbes that are in the living soil that are really helping it to thrive and be healthy. So root systems can, a really strong established perennial root system from a perennial perennial means a plant that stays in the soil year to year. Annual is one that you have to disturb the soil in between each one. A perennial just has this capacity to put so much organic matter, again, that term really just meaning carbon, life stuff, back into the soil, and to hold the soil in place, and to not need so much of that fossil fuel intensive fertilizer that I mentioned, because it is relying so much on a healthy soil ecosystem. So this particular photo, I didn't take it. I should have said that from the start. These two on the left are Adamah Farm. This is from National Geographic. And this is the Land Institute, which is a research community out in Kansas that's looking at producing perennial grains, and has some really amazing head start on perennial grains that exist, but just aren't quite there yet in terms of ease of harvest and those kinds of things. So this is just an example really of all three of these are examples of the future of regenerative farming, which really lies in perennials, including hopefully perennial grains, cover crops up here. And then here in the bottom left, these are chestnut trees at our farm at Adamah. We planted over 200 chestnut trees in 2021. And they're just beginning to pop out of these tubes. These tubes are little greenhouses almost for them. They're protecting them from vole damage, deer damage, and they're also creating a little warm microclimate for the trees. And this is called agroforestry, when you grow crops that are trees. And trees, of course, have just such an amazing ability to photosynthesize, to hold soil in place, to put carbon in the ground. And if we can have trees that produce food, then of course we're reforesting and farming at the same time. And one of the special things about the chestnut tree, we're growing not Native American chestnuts, because those are vulnerable to a blight. And so American chestnuts no longer really exist beyond some young ones that can survive up until they get to a point where they're vulnerable to the blight. But these are European and Asian varieties that are resistant to that blight. And chestnuts are a carbohydrate, so you can make them into flour. You can cook with them. You can have chestnut flour cookies. And again, just thinking about this puny little root here that needs so much fossil fuel intensive fertilizer to grow it, as compared to the deep root of a chestnut tree, is a big difference in terms of that carbon cycle that it's about. Okay, so I shared a lot there. Some of that may be new general information for folks. Some may be sort of a review of some things that some understandings that you already have. And I want to go a step deeper beyond thinking about just our choices as consumers. Of course, we can shop for chestnut flour products. We can, as consumers, we can get to know our local farmers and shop at the farmers market and ask them, what kind of cover crops are you growing? That's the best. I would say that is the best, hands down, way to figure out what kind of farm it is. You can look for their label, and it might say natural, and it might say, a bunch of words that sound really good. If you can get a farmer to tell you anything about their cover crop, or you ask them about their soil organic matter, or any of these words that I've used so far, and if they light up and are like, oh, I can't believe you just asked me that, and I can't wait to tell you, then you're talking to someone who's taking some care in the process. Okay, so we have our consumer capacity, and that is really big and really important, a really, really huge component of what we can do as eaters. And these are systemic issues. These are issues that are really, they're solved to some extent by consumer demand. And they're also created in large part by political systems and incentives to the farming industry. So what do I mean by that? The the um, the federal food policy landscape that we have in our country is largely centered around something called a farm safety net. That means crop insurance and it means subsidies for farms. These are not necessarily bad things. Do we want our farmers, when they have a flood, do we want them to, never be able to make a living and, destroy their businesses because of that experience? No, we want to have some, ideally, for a stable food system, some way of helping farmers from year to year. And the system that we have at the moment, it really incentivizes monoculture, meaning planting many acres of the same thing, and doesn't always incentivize cover cropping, agroforestry, perennial agriculture, those really important climate solutions. We do have programs, we have federal programs that incentivize those things. And in fact, in the Inflation Reduction Act, the big landmark climate legislation that, though flawed, has been so important in decarbonizing our economy, electrifying our grid, getting us started on those very important projects. It also doubled conservation incentives for farmers. So those conservation incentives mean, we at Adamah, we are enrolled in USDA conservation programs, ones that incentivize us, meaning give us payments to for our agroforestry program, for our cover cropping, for our, for reducing the amount that we disturb the soil. So the Inflation Reduction Act expanded those incentives in U.S. farming. There's a really big bill called the Farm Bill that you may or may not have heard of. That's actually, as I speak, the House Agriculture Committee is deep in the weeds of coming up with its version. The Senate Agriculture Committee as well. The House one is likely, so I hear. I represent Adamah as part of something called the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, which is a coalition of organizations working on sustainability and farming. And from what we hear, there's a good chance that we'll get a draft House bill this spring for a reauthorization of the Farm Bill, this big piece of legislation that covers a lot of how our food system works. So, and a big important goal for a Farm Bill for this year would be to hold on to those Inflation Reduction Act wins in terms of conservation incentives, and ideally even to expand them. So what does that mean? It means a lot of calling our House representatives and our senators and asking them to protect Inflation Reduction Act conservation funding in the Farm Bill. Here's an example of one way that I pitched into that process. So this was a day last May. Let's see, this would have been a couple weeks later than now. And this is a field of cover crop. These are our summer Adamah fellows harvesting and putting, you can't quite tell, but these are fancy little bottles. These actually are decorations for Shavuot that they're harvesting. But we went through this same process a week prior, harvesting some of the cover crop. Most of the cover crop we integrated into the soil, like I said, that's so important, but some of it we used for decor. And I had the opportunity to go to the USDA and speak with along with the U.S. Department of Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack and a number of legislators in the mix at USDA's Jewish American Heritage commemoration that happened last May at USDA. And I spoke about the value of cover crops and what they mean. And this is Jewish Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz here, and I was so proud. She's on board with thinking about forward thinking about climate, and she didn't know a lot about cover crops. Not everyone does. It's not everyone in everyone's wheelhouse. So we had harvested some of these and decorated all the tables at this, fancy USDA event with the cover crops, and I spoke about them, and she was so excited and inspired. She decided to take home her cover crops as a bouquet for her house. So an example of just whatever you got. If you happen to be a passionate cover crop grower like I am, bring that to the table. If you happen to be, a gardener or passionate about a Jewish recipe from your lineage that relates to climate, whatever it is, lean into it and then communicate that to folks that have some influence. So there's so much more to say, of course, about the Farm Bill and that process in this moment, because it's a big time for it. You can go to adamah.org/Farm Bill if you want to learn more about our campaign and that process. And you're also welcome to reach out to me. I'll share my email just if you're curious to learn more. So I do want to have just a couple minutes for questions, but before that, I'll share some important things that you can do if you're a non-farmer and you want to be climate friendly. Of course, we got to vote because that's important to that whole systems approach that I mentioned. We can also eat climate smart by centering plants, organic foods in our diets. We can support biodiverse farms. We can try perennials that maybe aren't part of the usual American table, like an aronia berry isn't just an example of a native berry to this area that is a perennial. That's kind of a special part of that process of regenerative farming. Research institutions like the Land Institute are doing a lot of amazing work. We can call our senators, our congresspeople. We can plant pollinator habitat. Often people want to know, like, what's the one thing I'm supposed to do? What's that one thing? Am I supposed to like never eat meat again? Am I supposed to, plant this one particular plant? Is that going to do it? And the answer is yes and no. I think that this is a really important framework for thinking about our relation to climate action. This word leaderful is just such a beautiful word. A leaderful transformation to a regenerative food system really relies on us finding our own climate action at the center of an intersection between what brings us joy, what work needs doing, and what we're good at. This is a Venn diagram from Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, and she's a writer and scientist and thinker and book editor, and she has a wonderful TED Talk that I recommend checking out if you want to go through this process for yourself. And I really recommend it, even if you think you know exactly what you're doing, because I think we so often get caught up in what we're not doing, feeling bad for the things that we aren't doing, or feeling, getting a bit in our heads about what's exactly the right thing to do. And really this idea that what we need is a leaderful transformation. We need to lean into the things that, the unique skills and joys that we have that are going to sustain us through working together in community toward climate action, and finding out and doing enough of the research to understand really what is the work that needs doing in terms of solutions. So I'll leave it there. I haven't seen, let's see. We're just about there at time. I'll share just a couple quick responses dealing with grass lawns. If you can get a few pollinator habitat plants in there, that's good. If over time, you don't have to do it all at once, but over time, transitioning to some plants that are good for native pollinators, that can be a really good thing. And she's Scott's rep. And thank you for this new updated graphic, Hannah. Okay. I'd love to answer more, but I think we're at time here. So I'm going to drop my email here in the chat, and feel free to follow up with me if you have questions.
Thank you so much, Janet. This has been truly fantastic. We are at time. We're actually 1 minute over. There is one more session to attend, and I think it's going to be a good one. It's all about college students taking action on college campuses, and that's our final session of the festival. So big thank you to Janna, and with that, we will adjourn.